So, picking back up on the second half of our section on affect and emotions. But before we get started, some quick updates and reminders. Your quiz 4 is due Friday at 11:59 p.m. And make sure that you complete the assigned reading for this week. As I've discussed, it's a really interesting reading. I've read it before when I've assigned it in the past, and then I also reread it again this weekend and really enjoyed it. I think it's very engaging and you'll move through it pretty quickly. And I think it also incorporates a lot of what we've discussed so far in this class, as well as the things that we've discussed in this section. And then finally, your activity 3 is now graded. And at this point, I'm halfway through grading activity 4. So that should be graded rather quickly. And again, make sure to watch supplementary videos for this week. I think they add a lot of dimension and various interests into the conversation that will just kind of help expand some of your thoughts and insights on affect and emotion. So, macro levels approaches to emotion. So, as we discussed previously, some of the major critiques of sociological and social psychology inquiry on affect and emotion is that it doesn't do a very good job at predicting. It's more so best suited to these approaches in retrospect. And it also is limited in terms of how it can connect macro level phenomena to micro level phenomena. So, in contrast to micro level analyses, macro approaches view human affective capacities as socially causal. The intensity of particular emotional experiences in the population or changes in emotion culture are outcomes of large scale features of social life. So, macro theorists tend to focus on particular emotions such as grief, anger, and love, things that can be examined more effectively on a macro scale. And so, this approach tries to um, quell some of those critiques. It tries to expand this inquiry into these topics into the macro level instead of just focusing on micro level actions. And so, one of the main things that we can focus on are the shaping of emotional experience and emotion culture. And again, this is from a macro level perspective. And one researcher identified four sociocultural factors which should affect the intensity and duration of grief in society. So again, um, they tend to focus on emotions such as grief, anger, happiness, those kinds of things. So the four sociocultural factors that have been identified um, to affect the intensity and duration of grief in society are one, investment in and significance of particular relationships, the mortality rates of the group, how much feelings are controlled or allowed freedom, and how much individuals are physically isolated from others in space and time. So, if you are not living close to someone, of course, that connection and that grief is going to be experienced differently than if you are interacting with that someone on a regular basis, or they live very close to you, they live within your community, or they're a neighbor, a member of your, um, you know, school or church or local organization, whatever it is that you're a part of. um, that grief may be experienced differently if you are in close physical proximity to this person or different people who you're grieving, and also in time. So, if it's someone that you knew a long time ago versus someone that you know now that you interact with on a regular basis now, or not even necessarily that you interact with on a regular basis now, but someone who you do interact with on some level now. And so, yes, we are talking about things that are occurring on the micro level, but it's more so grief in terms of um, like death in general, but also maybe very specific things. We'll get into an example here in a second. But you might think, like during the pandemic, for example, like this is something that's occurring to the whole world virtually. And, certainly within our own country, within our state, and within the Stillwater community. So it's not something that's just happening on the micro level, it's happening on the macro level. And so, but that's how we experience that is certainly influenced by these other sociocultural factors. So, one example is high infant mortality rates. And so, the higher the infant mortality rate, and thus the higher the risk of loss, the lower the emotional investment in children, and the shorter and less intense the grief response is to child deaths. And so, again, considering those sociocultural factors that influence our experience of grief, and they're these macro level factors, but they affect us and how we experience grief on the micro level and within our communities. And so the example I used here of high infant mortality rates, I specifically used a picture from the Great Depression. During that time, people had many children, and I think of stories that my granny told me. And, she was born well before the Great Depression, but she experienced it as a young woman, and she had a ton of brothers and sisters, and how it was just something that was regular and accepted that you would have siblings um, that would die, that would pass away, and she talked about different practices in terms of like the ways in which their parents would. Um, grieve those children and what it was like during that time. Because there was this high risk of loss, there seemed to be this lower emotional investment. Um, Again, to avoid or to quell some of that grief in some way to mitigate that. And so, because like well, there was a lot going on at that time, and that's very specific circumstances that made it very difficult for people to provide the proper nutrition um, and sanitation necessary to keep their children healthy and themselves healthy. Um, but we can think of this again in other very specific examples, like right now, and how are what's going on with the pandemic right now affecting the ways in which we experience such emotions and the ways in which we invest in certain relationships. And of course, this is something that's happening over a relatively short period of time. But if this something that lasted for many, many years, how might that affect our relationships with others and our experiences of different emotions, like grief, for example? And so, what's important to note here is that grief experiences can be a function of demographic factors. And so, again, that's thinking of like what are infants expected to survive at birth? Are they expected to survive infancy and make it into childhood? If that's an expectation, that experience of grief is going to be a lot more intense. Um, and so, considering those demographic factors and those more sociocultural factors that we discussed previously, as well as things like the prevalence of disease, quality of nutrition and healthcare, and so on. And so, again, in this example, to reiterate, is that the higher the infant mortality rate, and thus the higher the risk of loss, the lower the emotional investment in children, and the shorter and less intense the grief response to child deaths. And so, again, that's by no means saying that people who lost children during this time in particular did not grieve their children or didn't love their children. It's just more so looking at these broad strokes across society, and these expectations that we have about grief based on what is considered um, common for the time and based on these demographic factors. And so, another example is how researchers studied historical changes in American grief from the colonial period to the present. They got their data from the emotion culture of the time, which they got from recurrent themes in popular magazines, um, parenting manuals, marriage manuals, and other documents intended to teach sectors of the American public about anger and appropriate anger control. And what they found was that in the mid 1800s, industrialization and new market conditions during this time caused the home to be reconceptualized as an emotional haven for men in particular, from a heartless and competitive world. And consequently, anger control in women became crucial for a harmonious marriage and family life. Then, early in the 1900s, rising rates of labor unrest and white collar and female employment prompted growing concern about workers' emotions. At this time, maintaining morale and avoiding anger became labor relations goals, you know, from that point on. And these workplace norms subsequently affected the family in the form of parenting advice against anger. Anger has been and remains the central emotional enemy for contemporary Americans. And more recently, historical increases in American concerns about sibling jealousy, arguing that changes in effective intensity of family life due to smaller size and different parenting practices actually created more jealousy and thus more reason to worry. And so again, they're looking at different texts. This is mostly a textual analysis, but they're looking at tests. They're looking at themes of discussions of anger and managing emotions that not only carries over from the workplace due to these broad macro level uh, processes, but how that carries, moves down through these institutions and then down into family systems, affecting, parenting practices and individuals who grew up um, with those parenting practices and within those families during these times. And so you can track these historical changes in something like anger and how we conceptualize it, how we experience it, and a variety of sociocultural factors that influence our experience of anger on a macro scale. And so this is affects as organizing principles. One researcher has treated macrostructure as the product of human affective capacities. For example, suggesting that social differentiation and social stratification are shaped by several affective principles. It assumes that social bonds are based on intense, positive affective arousal, and that people seek arrangements which maximize this arousal. However, human affective resources are limited, so prolonged intense arousal is physiologically and psychologically debilitating. So, humans must limit the number of those to whom they are effectively attached. So, they have to limit the numbers of people they interact with on a regular basis. Otherwise, it's too overwhelming. As I'm sure many of you have heard, there's only a certain number of people who you can, reasonably, practically maintain a relationship with on some level. And some of these people are close, intimate relationships, while others are just more like acquaintanceships. Um, and people you see on a regular to semi regular basis. And there's only so many people with whom we can maintain these relationships before it's just too exhausting. It's just beyond our capacity. Um, and they found that the greater the density of a population, the greater the likelihoods that individuals will differentiate among others using observable characteristics such as sex, age, race, language, classifications. And these things require little cognitive effort. And they effectively stratify these differences. Thus, social inequalities are produced and sustained by innate affective motives and effective limitations, and very positively with population density. So they found that our likelihood to categorize people and to stratify people based on um, uh, these affect, these affects are um, or these effective stratifications occurs as the population becomes more dense. And so they say that this is a function of like our ability to maintain a certain number of um, effective attachments, meaning like relationships to other people. And so that this reduces our cognitive load and our stress when we're living in more population dense areas. So, this is one um, theory, one way of looking at it from a macro level is these affects are actually organizing principles or the way in which society is organized and stratified. But let's talk about applying these concepts in your career. So now that we've moved past kind of like the major critique and the response to that critique, I really wanted to touch briefly on how you can apply these in your own career. And from reading your work, I can see that you are all thinking about these things and you're trying to apply them to your own life, your own careers. Um, but just as a brief overview, um, as it's Um, I wanted to point out emotional labor in particular, but we'll move beyond that as well. So, emotional labor, for example, is requisite for organizational efficiency and displaying organizationally desired emotions by controlling your private feelings is high stakes because it affects your livelihood and your reputation, as well as those with whom you're working. So, first, I want you to, again, think back on role taking and the difference between reflexive role taking and empathetic role taking. So, again, reflexive role taking are, the emotions result from imagining how others would react to an individual's thoughts and behaviors. So, things like emotions like shame, guilt, embarrassment, um, pride, vanity, depending on how these imagined reactions of others play out in your head. And so, when ashamed, for example, you might behave altruistically in order to restore your pride or your sense of self. Whereas empathetic role taking are those emotions that result from mentally placing oneself in another's position and feeling what they might feel in that situation. So, on the one hand, you're experiencing feelings that they might feel in that situation, but you're also experiencing those more social emotions like empathy and compassion. And so I want you to consider the types of behaviors that might result from reflexive role taking versus empathetic role taking. And so, when thinking about applying this into your own life and your own career, thinking about how to take on these different roles and which is appropriate in different situations, and also what type of behavior will that elicit. And then one more time touching on emotional labor, and how it is, this attempt to change the intensity or quality of feelings so that they align with the situational requirements. It's how we present and manage our emotions slash behavior due to role expectations. And our reasons for engaging in emotional labor include, there are these conflicts between feelings and role expectations. We might do it to mitigate negative emotions of ourselves first and foremost, but also to mitigate the negative emotions of others. Because there are these situational feeling rules, and sometimes we're not only expected to manage our own emotions to meet those expectations, but we're also expected to manage the emotions of others. So, thinking about applying that to your own um, life. Um, Again, emotional labor is a requisite for organizational efficiency. And displaying these desired emotions by controlling your own feelings and presentation um, is very high stakes because it often affects your livelihood. It affects the people with whom you're working. So, as I was thinking about how to kind of discuss the ways in which you could apply this, I went back through everyone's introduction and what you wanted to do for your career, what you do for your major. I mean, I went there and kind of found these common themes that emerged. And some things I want you to think about, other than different types of role taking when we're kind of going through these, but thinking about in group normative conduct and out group stereotypes, identity verification and non verification, and the ways in which that influences not only your behavior, but the behavior of others. So, first, is how do you apply it in terms of building trust, managing expectations, and mitigating conflict? So, if you're going to be working as an engineer or a designer, you will definitely be involved in project management. You're going to have to foster relationships not only with clients, but with subcontractors, and trust and good communication and the ability to mitigate and manage conflict are critical skills in those situations. And so, how do you leverage what you know about um, group cohesion, cooperation, and building trust? These different group dynamics. Taking what you know from this class, taking what you've learned in this section in particular, how do you leverage that knowledge and those that knowledge of those concepts to enhance your own skills in these areas? And for those of you in particular who want to work in, let's say, education or counseling, therapy, you want to be a psychologist, anything, a social worker, you want to work with people in some capacity. It's important that you convey the emotions that are not only appropriate for the situation, but will make the person feel comfortable and in control. And however, sometimes while it's important to meet those expectations in the moment, particularly when it comes to emotions, um, and building trust within that interaction, within that relationship, sometimes you might want to defy expectations. That might be what the situation calls for. That someone enters into this interaction and they have certain expectations of you, that you're going to treat them a certain way or view them in a certain way. Um, Maybe, there you want to portray yourself. And you want to engage in the interaction in such a way that will defy those expectations. But first, you kind of have to think about your own identities, and what they're going to, most recognize in you, and consider, maybe their identities and what you recognize in them, where they're coming from, um, maybe why they have these preconceived notions of you. And it might actually be very productive for you to defy those expectations in a good way, in a way that is productive, and helps to foster trust and understanding within that interaction. And again, making others feel in control, respected, heard, and cared for. Here with this application, I'm thinking about, people again who are working in mental health, in education, those of you who want to go into law enforcement. I think it's incredibly important that you understand how to make others feel in control and respected, heard, and cared for to build a rapport. Rapport and communication is so important, particularly when you're working not just with individuals, but with a community as a whole. And how do you not only portray yourself, but how do you interact with people in such a way that conveys this sense of that I do care, that I am listening, I do hear you, I do have respect for you. Um, and this is, I want to have a conversation, I want to understand, we're here to work together, um, but also managing, again, like your own emotions within that situation. Um, while managing the emotions and the responses of others to some extent. And what can you take from, again, thinking back in terms of, think about like role taking in the situation, reflexive versus empathetic role taking, and what sorts of behavior will that foster? And what does the situation call for? Does it call for you to anticipate how they might view you based on maybe their identity or your identity? Or does it call for you thinking about how it would make you feel in that situation, thinking about how they might feel in response to you? But then also recognizing when others are engaging in emotional labor and why. And this can apply to anyone, whether you're working with a client, with a student, with parents, with coworkers, with your boss, with whomever. But recognizing when others may or may not be engaging in emotional labor is important, because, maybe that's something that is going to be. Going to be an issue in terms of communication. Like you realize that communication isn't as clear as you had initially thought it was, or this person feels uncomfortable. Like maybe on the surface, they're being, calm and polite, but um, inside you can tell that there's some discomfort or frustration with the situation. And that's something that you want to address immediately. So, what can you take from, again, thinking back on things like the different types of role taking, um, and thinking about those concepts we discussed in the section on identity, and why people might feel frustrated, why people um, might behave in certain ways, depending on how they are interacting with others. Like, why are they behaving in a way? Um, Not necessarily that is. Essentially, what are they responding to in that environment? Who are they responding to? What behavior are they responding to, and why? And how can you do something to influence that and make that to be like perhaps a more positive interaction, clearer communication, more productive collaboration as a whole? And then finally, and what I think is one of the most important, is managing perceptions of outgroups and emotions influencing your behavior. And while this can apply to everyone, I definitely thought of it in terms of those of you who want to go into education or law enforcement in particular. And that's, and even healthcare. For those of you who want to go into healthcare, or for those of you who want to practice law someday, you're going to be interacting with a lot of people on a regular basis, and those interactions are most certainly not going to always be positive. Whether that's coming from you or from the other people you're working with, it's going to be challenging, again, because you're working with other humans. And there's a lot of group dynamics and social forces at work in these interactions. And so it's important that, to manage your perceptions of outgroups and understand how those dynamics work, and why you might be, applying certain stereotypes to someone. Okay, well, you're viewing them as someone who isn't a part of your in group. So maybe pause for a second and, reflect on the situation and what groups are present. Who do you view as an in group? Who do you view as an out group? What's the nature of that relationship? What sorts of stereotypes are associated with not just the other groups that you see, but your own group? How do people view you? What are the normative expectations within your own group, and how are you expected to respond? And is that something that will um, be of benefit to the situation, or will that be something that is negative within that interaction? And thinking about how people are responding to you. You can think about things like identity verification, non verification, and all of the emotions that are associated with that. What, you know, Going back to emotional labor, you will be engaging in that regularly. And this is all part of that emotional labor, is, making sure, thinking back to like impression management, it's not just meeting the expectations of your particular role, but it's also meeting the expectations of the situation, and those who are present. And so this is just bringing in discussions of emotions and how emotion comes into play within all of these interactions. So being aware of your own emotions and your own responses to people, and thinking about why that might be the case. But then also looking at people's responses to you and asking yourself why that might be the case. Because emotions are something that we tend to be able to recognize a little bit more. It's more so like a cue in our environment that cues us to think about things like in group normative conduct, out group stereotypes, identity verification, non verification, our definition of the situation, impression management, emotional labor, all of these things. Um, it tends to be a cue in our environment. So when we talk about emotions and their importance, typically we've talked about it from the perspective of research, but within your everyday life, there's importance, there's value in recognizing um, these things that we've discussed over the past 2 weeks, because they're cues. They're cues that prompt us to make these considerations and to draw from those, that knowledge and those skills that we learned and developed in, in various classes like this one. But other than that, your quiz 4 is due Friday at 11:59 p.m. and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week. Thanks.